Welcome back to Radio Free Market. I'm Zoe Russell, standing in for Michael McKay. We have Thomas DiLorenzo, and we were just talking about how we can demystify Lincoln to everyone you know, students especially. One of the spectacular lies, as it's called, is the idea that the South had no constitutional right to secede. I just read on whitehouse.gov, though, that Lincoln thought secession was illegal, so he used federal power to invade the South and protect the law. So if the president says it's not so, do the states actually have the right to secede?
Well, ask yourself this question. If read Article 7 of the Constitution, which says that the states ratify the Constitution didn't ratify the states, and ask yourself if the Founding Fathers would have adopted the Constitution if it said that if any state changes its mind at any time in the future, the U.S. government has the right to invade that state, mass murder its civilian population, and burn its towns to the ground. That's what Lincoln's army did on many occasions. And, of course, the answer to that question would be absolutely not. That would be preposterous for anyone to even contemplate that James Madison would have supported the United States Constitution or Thomas Jefferson if that's what it said. Jefferson himself supported the idea of secession late in his life. People asked him what would happen if the Union broke apart into several sections, and what he said was, they will all be our children, they will all be Americans, and we would wish them all well. Lincoln was very different. He was the anti-Jefferson. He pretty much said, pay federal taxes or die. He was really a horrible tyrant in that regard. And as I said, the Union was voluntary. The New England Federalists plotted for 14 years to secede from the Union after Thomas Jefferson was elected. Northern abolitionists wanted to secede because they didn't want to be a part of a country that had slaves in it. There was a secession movement in the middle states, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, New York, and Pennsylvania in the 1850s. Up until Lincoln, Americans believed, well, of course we have a right to secede. The Union is voluntary. Lincoln just simply made up out of thin air the idea that the Union was somehow a one-way Venus flytrap from which you could never escape. And of course, further evidence is that at the outset of the war, the Congress proposed several laws to outlaw secession, and that would tell you that they knew it was legal. Otherwise, why would you need a law to make it illegal? Right. And after the war, it wasn't until after the war that the Supreme Court, which was a kangaroo court of Lincoln appointees by then, issued a declaration that secession was unconstitutional. But it never did that beforehand.
Well, we have a caller, Leo from Massachusetts. Leo, do you have a question?
Hi, thanks for taking the call. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder, do you bring up the aspect of J.P. Morgan agitating both sides of this, and that the Rothschilds wanted to break up the United States into two separate countries?
Well, if that's true, that doesn't mean they had any ability to do it. In fact, Jefferson believed that the kind of constitutional republic that was created in his time probably wouldn't work as the population got bigger and the government and the country got bigger after the Louisiana Purchase. That's why he was referring to earlier. I mentioned he in letters in the 1820s before he died of maybe 5 or 6 or 7 different confederacies. And that's how federalism, American federalism, could work. So even if somebody from Europe or anywhere else wanted to break the country up into different sections, that would have been a virtue, not a vice. Because you look at our government now. It's really preposterous to think that we have 535 people regulate the lives of 330 million.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, the thing is just that, from what I've understood, that J.P. Morgan was a major activist on both sides, and the South did support was supported by.
There was no major secret Wizard of Oz string puller with bags of money in his pockets. There were a lot of people involved. There were a lot of people who lent money to the U.S. government to finance the war. The South went into debt also to finance its side of the war. There was no one Wizard of Oz that was manipulating this. I've had other people tell me that the Pope was behind the war somehow, but that's just one of the weirder
other repercussions.
There.
of the Civil War that aren't discussed. There's a book called Early Victorian Holocaust, and that was about how England, because of the blockade of the South, forced India to grow cotton to the detriment of the food production. And this was caused by a net effect of our Civil War. And that's not discussed. But the important point, I think, here is that England, the Rothschilds of England, France, and Spain all wanted the United States broken up, and they supported the South as one methodology to break up the Union. And
thank you for your call. We've got to cover some more Lincoln stuff, so. Well, I guess I'll just go into another topic. I want to talk about Lincoln's method of total war, of complete destruction, scorched earth warfare. Can you tell us what was the makeup of this policy that he had?
Well, from the very beginning of the war, the very first major battle, the Battle of First Manassas, civilians were targeted, their private property was destroyed and taken. And, and it got worse and worse as the war went on. For example, in Atlanta, Georgia, the Confederate Army had left. There was no army there. And so for 4 or 5 days, General Sherman used the private homes as target practice for his cannons. And they burned down and destroyed 90% of Atlanta. And this is after the army had gone. There was no army in Atlanta. It was just waging war on civilians. And then when it was over, there were about 2,500 civilians left. They were forced out of their homes in November after 2 big armies had just passed through the area. There was no food or anything around to speak of. And then the entire Shenandoah Valley was burned down. All the homes, all the businesses, all the farms, all the cattle and the livestock were stolen by the U.S. Army, and it was occupied at that time by no army. It was 1854. Only women and children and old men and handicapped men who were war veterans, and they were all forced out of their homes. And if you read the famous book Civil War Trilogy, or any account of the Shenandoah Valley, the burning of the Shenandoah Valley, there were thousands of women and children and old men just walking up the valley, wandering around homeless as a result of that. The historian Jeffrey Hummel says that he estimated that about 50,000 Southern civilians were killed in the war, and that had to include a lot of slaves and free blacks who lived in the South as well. And so this was the first example in modern times of total war that we saw in World War I and World War II in Europe. And Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, and Lincoln laid the groundwork. They set the example for the ugliness of total war on civilians that we saw in the 20th century. So
it's the myth that Lincoln was at once a master commander, micromanager of the Army, but completely unaware of these civilian deaths. I know that he's described
one of the tall tales told by James McPherson, the historian. He brags in one of his books about what a great micromanager of the war effort Lincoln was. He knew everything. He spent endless hours in the War Department telegraph office, and McPherson says, but then he's supposedly totally unaware of all the death and destruction that was going on. And I think no one above the age of 3 ought to believe such a thing. But that's what Lincoln's excuse makers say. In fact, in my book, I quote Sherman from his memoirs as saying that when he met up with Lincoln after Sherman's march, Lincoln especially enjoyed the stories of the plundering of the Southern civilians and their property. So of course he knew about this. He was instructing it. And another thing Lincoln did that has come out fairly recently by the mainstream historians is that he tried to assassinate Jefferson Davis. There was a captain in the Union Army named Dahlgren who was killed outside of Richmond, and he had orders on him with Abe Lincoln's signatures on them to assassinate Jefferson Davis. And modern forensics has been used to determine that was in fact Abe Lincoln's signature, and so this actually happened. And this is not me, the Lincoln critic that has said this. This is a historian by the name of Sears, who's written many fine books on such things as the Battle of Chancellorsville and some of the famous Civil War battles. But he's the one who did the research on this.
Okay, let's take one more caller real quick. Coy from Missouri, are you there with a question?
Yes, ma'am. I wanted to maybe explain one of the reasons maybe for Lincoln's, lust for power and his aggressiveness and his drive. And this is something that I didn't believe when I first heard it. And I started researching it, and I found it confirmed a number of times. But it is when Lincoln went to marry Todd, her family didn't want her to marry him, and they insisted that he change his name because they didn't want their family associated with that nationality. And so he changed his name to Lincoln. His name originally was Abraham Springsteen.
Thanks, Coy, for calling.
You're welcome. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
I've never heard that story before.
Mm-hmm.
First time I've heard it.
But I don't think it's too deniable that he had a lust for power, maybe.
Well, yeah, I think anybody who rises to that political office is somewhat of an egomaniac, and Abe Lincoln was no exception. He was widely regarded as a master politician, so he had to be the type of person who was just, egomaniacal is the only word for it. That's somebody who wants to be president, and someone who would do the things he did, such as suspending the writ of habeas corpus and arresting and imprisoning without due process tens of thousands of northern civilians. Anyone who would take it upon themselves to do such a thing has a really dictatorial mindset.
So what could have gotten you thrown in jail by Lincoln and his secret police?
Anybody who criticized the government, there was a confiscation law, for example, that was passed that said that anybody who even said something positive about the opposing side, about the Confederate Army, could have all of his private property confiscated by the government. And so the U.S. government had spies everywhere. They recruited spies just like the KGB did in Soviet Union days to report on people who were suspected of doubting Lincoln and his administration. And as I said, Lincoln himself said, even if you're silent and do not proclaim your support of his administration, he considered that to be treasonous. And that's how thousands of Northerners, including the mayor of Baltimore, Francis Scott Key's grandson, who was a newspaper editor who editorialized against suspending the writ of habeas corpus, a congressman from Maryland was put in prison, and Lincoln even deported the most outspoken member of the Democratic Party, Clement Vallandigham of Dayton, Ohio, for merely criticizing him. And Lincoln came along, and his administration claimed that he was deterring enlistment in the Army by criticizing the administration. Therefore, they deported him. And these are all the acts of a tyrant and a dictator.
So with a lawyer's mind, he also discovered lots of new powers in the Constitution for the executive branch. What were some of these powers?
He invented many war powers. He actually launched an invasion of the southern states before the Congress got involved, and he funded it, too. That really was not a presidential power that he had. The president does not have the power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. It can be suspended, but it has to be suspended by Congress, according to the U.S. Constitution. And Congress did eventually get around to doing that. But then after the Civil War, the U.S. Supreme Court said that it was illegal for either of them, Congress or the president, to have done it as long as the civil courts in the North were operating, which they were. And so even Lincoln's defenders call him a benevolent dictator. They'll say he was a dictator, but he was a good dictator. And that's the old ends justify the means philosophy. That's the philosophy of every tyrant in the history of the world. The ends justify the means. And that's what the so-called Lincoln scholars all say about this.
And even though they found it to be illegal that he suspended habeas corpus, because of the Indemnity Act, there would have been no way to go after him. Can you tell us about the Indemnity Act?
Well, yes, they had a law passed, an Indemnity Act, it was passed Congress saying that you couldn't go after Lincoln or his administration or anybody involved in the illegal imprisonment of people during the war. And that's why, by the way, after the war, some of the lawyers in the North, especially in places like New York City, were very adamant about enforcing the Constitution. And one of them, a man named O'Connor, volunteered to be Jefferson Davis's lawyer when they put Davis in prison for 3 years after the Civil War. But this man, O'Connor from New York City, who was considered to be a top lawyer in the country, lent his time to get Jefferson Davis finally out of prison. And because he, like other Northerners, were disgusted at the imprisonment of many of their clients without due process during the war.
So Lincoln also introduced the military-industrial complex to us. So I know that some people call it the military-industrial financial complex. How did Lincoln finance his war?
Well, this was the first big major war where there were massive military contracts given out to finance the war. For example, when I was in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's hometown, his next-door neighbor, there's a little plaque next to the house of his next-door neighbor, and it said that he got the contract for tin cups to the U.S. Army during the Civil War. And I'm sure that was not a competitive bid. It was a sweetheart deal. He was another well-connected member of the Whig Party in Illinois who happened to have a tin cup manufacturing business, and so he got the contract. And so that sort of thing really got started with the Civil War, and then of course it exploded with World War I and World War II. But if you want to talk about, I call it the military-industrial congressional complex because it involves Congress too being involved in handing out sweetheart non-bid contracts. But that's where it all got started.
I see. So, and obviously we still have consequences from the financial side of Lincoln today and lots of other consequences just from his dictatorship. Can you tell us about some of those consequences that we're still facing?
Oh, yeah. Well, every time the government wants to abolish some more of our civil liberties, they usually start quoting Abraham Lincoln. All during the reign of George W. Bush, his supporters kept saying, well, we need to suspend habeas corpus. Michelle Malcolm, the journalist, wanted to start putting Muslim Americans in concentration camps. She wrote a whole book on it, about it, but they always quote Abe Lincoln by saying, if Lincoln did it, therefore it must be right to do. And so that's one bad example that he set, the evisceration of the Constitution. But also, more substantially, he highly centralized the government control of the money supply with the Legal Tender Act and the National Currency Act. It was an important road on the way to the creation of the Fed some years later. We had high tariffs imposed at the 50 to 60% level. It lasted for 60 years after the Civil War.
Well, let me interrupt you there.
They opened the whole ball game of corporate welfare en masse.
We'll come back and talk more about the American system. Welcome back to Radio Free Market. When we left off, Dr. DiLorenzo, you were talking about the continuation of the American system that we have today as one of the main consequences of Lincoln. Do people see this mercantilist system as capitalism?
Yeah, that's been a big area of confusion for a long time. Beginning with Lincoln's regime, we've basically transformed the U.S. economy into really economic fascism, the ostensible private property that is so heavily regulated and controlled by government that it's not really private. It's to a very large extent it serves the purposes of the state as much as anything. Every business person knows that they have to spend endless hours complying with governmental edicts and regulations, for example. And also, on the other end of it, they lobby for favors and subsidies and all sorts of other things. And that really is one of the legacies of the Lincoln administration, which was the final victory of the old Hamiltonian idea from Alexander Hamilton of the connection between business and government. But that's not capitalism. Capitalism is free markets. It's voluntary exchange. It's using the price system. It's not crony capitalism. That's what we've got today and have had for a long, long time. Crony capitalism to a very large extent. It's not 100% of our economy, but it's a very, very big part of it. And that's it. All got started with the Civil War. Even if you ignore the whole issue of slavery, there are other things that came out as a consequence of the war, and this is one of them, and it's a bad consequence. That's one of the reasons I wrote my book, How Capitalism Saved America, to try to educate some people on what capitalism really is, and it's not the system that gets blamed for all the troubles we're in, such as the housing fiasco. That was created by the Fed, the housing market fiasco, the Fed and Fannie Mae and other government institutions that influenced the housing industry. It wasn't the free market.
Right. It's extremely important to get an actual economist viewpoint on history rather than just historians that have no education in economics.
Yeah, well,
sorry, go ahead.
Historians are not shy about making pronouncements about economics, even though they have never studied the subject for one day. And the Lincoln historians are especially bad in that regard. And they tend to say very silly things like, he had good intentions, therefore his policies must have been good. But of course, anybody, above the age of 10 ought to understand that good intentions don't necessarily lead to good results. People can make mistakes based on, bad knowledge or lack of knowledge of the field of economics.
Right, and in Lincoln's case, it was both bad. He had bad intentions and bad economics. Can you tell us about
he was a politician. It's always a very dangerous thing for
the right
incentive to have egomaniacal politicians in charge.
Can you tell us about your online Mises Academy course, The Great Centralizer? Lincoln,
you go to Mises.org, MESES.org, and click on Mises Academy. I'm teaching a 6-week online course on Lincoln, the Great Centralizer. It's one night a week for a 45-minute lecture and then about an hour of Q&A. And students get a very nice certificate of accomplishment at the end if they wish. If they want to take quizzes and get a grade, they can do that, or they can just take it for their general knowledge. And I also put together some nice online readings that can be very educational for the students. And it should be fun. It begins on this Tuesday, the 18th of January.
So we still have time to enroll in it?
Yes, you can still enroll even up to a week or so after the course starts, because the lectures will be taped.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. DiLorenzo, for being our guest today. I know that course will be awesome because there was so much that we didn't cover today. So I'm going to leave us with what Lou Rockwell always says about you. I want professors and Lincoln Court historians to have the fear of Tom DiLorenzo in you. You'll always have to worry that the truth about Abraham Lincoln has filtered into your classroom. So you don't have to be in school, but students of every age, y'all should sign up for this Mises Academy course at mises.org. So signing off, this is Zoe Russell with Radio Free Market. Please visit us on the web at radiofreemarket.com. You can subscribe to all of our shows on iTunes or download this and all of our archives for free. Until next week, wherever you are, please stand up for freedom. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Tom.